you have to learn the periodic table of the elements,
Yes.
invented by Mendeleev, the great Russian scientist, right, who I greatly respect. So I said, okay, let's have a Mendeleev-type table
Right.
for all the philosophies and all the religious traditions.
Mm-hmm.
And I worked on it with students, bright sixth form students in a philosophy club. We came up with the list of categories. So the green ones are the pagan ones, primal religions they're called.
Quite a lot of them.
Yeah, that's where humanity, we were all pagans earlier on, 100,000 years ago. We were all in the green.
Right.
That includes ancient Egyptians. So in that former life I was a pagan ancient Egyptian teacher in that Hermetic tradition. It includes the Druids, it includes the Wiccans, and all the other varieties of pagans, right?
Right.
And the most shamanic, the ancient shamanic traditions. This is like the hydrogen of the later elements, because all the later evolved religions emerged out of that pagan tradition.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so then there's the other kinds. So these are the Hindu. These are new religious movements, the grey. You've got all the Christians are here in the blue, and there's two lots of them.
Why are they in separate places?
Well, basically, it's kind of partly an aesthetic thing, partly a scientific thing. So the Christian tradition is split into the earlier ones and the later ones, you know. But it's not quite that simple. The Jewish tradition is down the side here. Again, sort of from the early down to the modern.
Right.
The Chinese are the pink ones, the Buddhist are the red, and the Islamic are the green, and so on. There's also the Persian ones, which are like the purple ones and things, and the Jain and the Sikh, and the Shinto. So they're all there.
Right.
Now, where would that teaching be? Well, I would have been up here in the pagan ancient Egyptian one, but because we studied Greek philosophy, I also would have known about Aristotelian thought, Platonic thought, which are down here in the yellow philosophical ones, Pythagoreanism and so on. They're all listed, right? The student that I had, you know, this wonder rabbi, as it were, he would have been from the Jewish tradition. My understanding, and I've done a commentary on the 6 Gospels, so the 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, but also Mary Magdalene and Thomas's Gospel, which are the Gnostic Gospels,
Right.
and the books of Enoch, one of which definitely he read, the first book of Enoch. And Jesus was from a proto-Kabbalistic background. You see, I don't think I was his only teacher. I think I was possibly one of the most important. But I think he had other teachers, and I think he'd been learning the proto-Kabbalah. I think he knew the books of Enoch. And, I mean, the Gospels tell us John the Baptist was one of his teachers. There's an interesting book out which has John the Baptist having links to Egypt. And that some of his disciples were in Egypt. That's interesting. And even some claim that Simon Magus, who became one of the very earliest kind of Christian Druid figures, also had links to Egypt.
Right.
We know that the Gnostic Christians flourished in Egypt, and the Gnostic Gospels were written down in Coptic, which was the Egyptian language.
Right.
So, you know, this is a tool that you could begin to map the complexity. Part of my argument about why we need more religious studies, both in schools and universities, is because our thinking about it at the moment is very simplistic. We think that somebody is either a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew, and therefore the wars are going to go on forever.
Yeah.
I know enough, having gone into depth on all the esoteric parts of all of the colours, because in each of these colours you'll find esoteric Islam, esoteric Judaism,
Right.
etc., Sufism, Ishmaelism, and the esoteric traditions. You know that those are all very close to each other. So the great Sufis of Spain, like Ibn Arabi, could totally understand the great Kabbalists of Spain, like Moses de Leon. You know, they spoke the same language. And in fact, many of the greatest Jewish thinkers of Spain wrote in Arabic. So they literally spoke the same language, you know. So the tool of the table, the periodic table of the world's religions and philosophies, teaches us that behind the outer display of, oh my God, it's blue, no, it's red, it's yellow, it's green, let's go to war, is the one white light which is the source of the whole rainbow, right?
Right.
And one of the inspirations behind this table is Sir Isaac Newton, who I greatly respect as a scientist and philosopher. Newton was a mathematician at Cambridge.
Right.
And I went to his manor house where he discovered the mathematics of the laws of gravity when I was teaching in Mansfield, because it's not far. And I kind of communed with Newton. And I've been to Cambridge. My daughter did a degree at Cambridge. And he wrote a book on religions in his lifetime. He was like a Freemason proto-universalist.
Right. Right.
And he said, he went to the theological faculty at Cambridge, said, can I publish this book? I'm only a scientist and mathematician, but I've dabbled a bit in philosophy. And they told him, no, it's heresy, Isaac, put it away in a drawer, or you'll be sacked. And basically what Isaac said is that just as there's one white light that becomes the 7 rainbow colours, so there's one primal religion, which is universal truth, which then becomes the colours of all the revealed religions.
Right.
Right? And that don't get so fussed about which colour you're in, because you're all from the one light.
Right.
And-
And just interpretations.
Yeah, and that inspired me with the table, because I found that book. It wasn't published until 1954 by the University of Liverpool.
Right.
It wasn't allowed to be published at that. Can you imagine? Newton's own philosophy of peace, in effect. So this table is an homage also to Newton's theology and saying, you know, let's get it out of the cupboard, folks, because the hour's getting late.
Right.
You know.
Yeah. Before we started talking here, I was looking at a film about Jesus in preparation for us talking about this.
Okay.
And they said that there are many years that are just unaccounted for. I think it was between 12 and 30 years.
Mm.
Do you have any idea about this meditational experience, where that might have been?
I've only got my bit of the jigsaw puzzle.
Right.
In that past life regression, I didn't. I mean, I kind of would like to go back with another past life regressionist and revisit that life and ask some other questions. I'd have a list of questions, you know.
Yeah, get some details.
Yeah, yeah. I didn't have any information about where else he might have been. I have read other accounts that had him go to India and study, you know, even with Buddhist teachers.
Yeah.
I've read accounts that have him go to the Celtic world and study with people in Britain or Gaul. Those are all possible. I think that he was an advanced character who, the reason that, and it was some years later that I discovered a book called The Foreigner by an English academic writer who speculated that actually Jesus spent some of his missing years in Egypt.
Yeah.
Now that was very interesting because that was after my past life regression. And I didn't discuss this with anybody. I didn't, because it all seemed a bit far-fetched. I just sort of sat on it and carried on doing what I'm doing anyway.
Right.
But in this book, I think the author's called Stewart, he goes into quite a lot of detail about evidence that he thinks Jesus probably spent part of those missing years in Egypt.
Yeah.
And that corroborates my experience. There's other evidence, which is that the name Jesus was quite common among Jewish people in Alexandria. It was a popular name.
Yeah.
In the Jewish wisdom scriptures, Ecclesiasticus, it's dedicated to Jesus ben Sirach, who was, you know, a wise teacher a couple of 100 years before Jesus the Christ. And my speculation, it didn't come up in the past life regression, this is just me logically figuring it out afterwards. I think Joseph, the father of Jesus, consort of Mary, who took Jesus as a baby to Egypt, and that is in the Gospels, in Matthew, we know that happened, must have had family relatives living in Alexandria among the Jewish community there, which is very large, because that's where he goes for safety when Herod's out to kill the babies.
Mm.
He has a dream, and Joseph pops down to Egypt, which isn't far away.
Right.
It's a couple of days' travel, maybe 3 days or something.
Right.
You know, it's just down through Gaza along the coast, and you're in Egypt.
Right.
And so easily they could have gone there, and they did.
Right.
Now stands to reason that, and the thing is, the Jewish community in Egypt was extremely advanced intellectually, much more so than back in Judea. And the greatest thinker was called Philo. Now Philo's commentaries on the Bible are all Neoplatonic. Philo was learned in the Bible, but also Greek philosophy.
Mm.
And Jesus' teaching, when he comes back and starts his teaching, as we can tell from the Gospels, is what you'd expect from a highly educated, Alexandrian trained Jewish intellectual who'd studied at the feet of Philo and learned the Hermetic mysteries.
Right.
It's what you'd expect. And of course it didn't go down so well in the little country villages of back home,
Yeah.
who kind of wanted to stone him, and what's he talking about, you know. He was too cosmopolitan, Jesus. He'd been off to California
Right.
and learned cosmic wisdom, and now he was coming back to tell the fishermen, like, you know, what was really going on, and
Yeah.
how you should read the Bible is not literally but allegorically.
Right.
Well, this was for heresy, you know,
Yeah.
to them, because they didn't know what, they didn't have that higher education.
Right.
So to me it explains a lot of the dynamic and the conflict that occurs in Jesus' life.
Right. But I mean, you have studied like most religions, right?
Yeah.
And do you think that you can see echoes of what Jesus was teaching? Are there echoes of other, like Egyptian teachings or Buddhist teachings, or like do you feel you can tell like he's been studying other religions, or
Yes.
from what he's teaching himself?
Yes, I mean that's why I did a detailed commentary on the Gospels, right?
Right.
And I've gone into detail every line of what we think Jesus spoke.
Right.
I've explained in detail. You can listen to it on my Global Marine University website, you know, explaining in detail. And where there are echoes, I mean, there are amazing passages in the Gospels which are almost line for line the same as the book of Enoch. For instance, we can see that Jesus was inspired by that to play the role of Enoch. And Enoch was sent from the highest heaven. He was the first explorer who descended to the highest heaven to commune with the highest archangels and with the divinity, God, Yahweh. And then he's sent back down to earth. Oh, and he's shown the karmic scrolls in the highest heaven. Like everything we do is kept a record of, right?
Right.
And Enoch sees the record. He becomes for a time like the recording scribe of Mart, effectively. And then he's sent back down to earth to tell us that, like, to behave, really, like to warn us. And that is so much what Jesus' mission had been. You can tell. He'd been reading his Enoch, you know, and had Enochian experiences. He'd ascended to those spiritual kingdoms and had those visionary experiences, which then filled him with a sense of urgency. He had to spread justice and truth on the planet.
Right. Right.
And you get that same thing also in Buddhism, because Buddha broke through to the highest heaven worlds of Dharma in his enlightenment, and then came back to our plane. I mean, he could have just drifted off and entered what they call, you know, the highest nirvana and not bothered to teach, but he said, no, I've got to come and teach the local villagers, the fishermen, the ploughmen, you know. And so just like Jesus, he bothered to go and spread that. Again, he called it the turning of the wheel. I went to Sarnath, actually, a couple of years ago in India, where Buddha gave his first sermon and sat and meditated on that. There's a great parallelism between what Buddha did 500 years before Jesus, and then what Jesus did. And they were both teaching compassion, love.
Right.
Now, was there an influence? Did Jesus spend time studying in Kashmir? I suspend judgment, you know, I don't know. That's not what came up in my past life regression. Another explanation is that when you break through into enlightenment, you reach a place of universal wisdom, which is universal and beyond any cultural specificity, and can then you can download it into the cultural language of your time and space. So Swedenborg in Sweden, when he had his visionary experiences, he sort of downloads it in a way that the Swedes are going to understand, or the Europeans. When your Wiccans, Gerald Gardner and co, when they have their visionary experiences, they bring this down as Wicca, their teachings, and they're packaged in a way that will be understood by those people. Buddha did it in a way that was understandable by him, and I think Jesus downloaded in a way that the average disciple could mostly understand.
Yeah. I think we talked about this before sometimes. I look at it as when you download this thing that it also gets filtered through who you are. So it's not the same for every person because it gets filtered through your brain and your experience and so on.
Yeah.
So it comes out differently, even if it's the same source. Sort of.
Yes, and that's a good thing, and yet can cause trouble, because when you get two people like supposedly talking to the highest spheres of heaven, and then one downloads the Quran and the other downloads the New Testament,
right.
And there's a few hundred years gap, and then their followers create armies and they're fighting each other, and there's crusades, and so what I've been trying to do as a scholar, as sort of spiritual empiricist, which is what I call myself, following on from John Locke's idea of empiricism in logic and spiritual matters, right? So I'm trying to trace back to the source of the different, transpersonal downloads of history. That's why I've done a commentary on the Quran, which has been one of my most important works, perhaps, and I would love every Muslim on the planet to read it, and everyone that has a problem with Islam on the planet to read it, every Jew and Christian. What I've tried to explain in my commentary on the Quran is I've tried to think back to the mind of Muhammad as he downloaded those verses.
Yeah.
And I tried to eavesdrop on the kind of mental conversation that was going on for Muhammad with Allah, with the Absolute. Because I love Islam. I'm a kind of Sufi. I've taken Sufi initiations. I love Islam. But the real Islam, the authentic spiritual core of Islam, not the outer packaging. And my understanding, you see, it's very interesting that according to Islam, Abraham had two lineages of descendants. One from his Egyptian wife, who was called Hagar. Abraham loved Hagar. She was Egyptian, gorgeous, to die for. But his first wife, Sarah, was really jealous of Hagar.
Right.
And with Sarah, he had Isaac, as his son. And whereas with Hagar, he had Ishmael. And he had Ishmael first, because initially Sarah couldn't conceive, couldn't have children. So she said, well, why don't you take my handmaid, Hagar, and see if you can have a baby with her. So Abraham said, okay, I'll give it a whirl. And they had Ishmael. Everything should have been fine, but then Sarah's jealousy kicked in. And after she got pregnant with Isaac, she made Abraham kick Hagar out of the family into the desert, which is like really mean and nasty. Like, having set this up.
Well, if she did set it up, that's what.
That's what the Bible says. That's so far as we know, and
right.
That seemed, if you believe any of this is true and not just stories, and I think there must be some historical basis to all this. I believe there was a historical character that later, we called Abraham. So then he kicks Hagar out into the desert with her young boy, Ishmael. And they travel, they don't have much water. And it's a really sad story. And eventually they come to an area in the Hijaz. And they're taken care of, miraculously. An angel appears. And this is what the Arabs believed for centuries. And they believed they were the descendants of Ishmael. And Muhammad was born into a family that were guardians of the Quraysh in Mecca, and that was where Hagar and Ishmael ended up. Their oral tradition told them that. And that was why Mecca was so sacred. So that's interesting. If it's true that and I've gone into this in the commentary on the Quran, because without knowing the background, the Quran makes no sense at all.
Right.
If you know this and you, as a working hypothesis, say that, okay, so there was an Egyptian ancestress, and this is where Ishmael came from, and they had their own spiritual lineage there. Equally important to the Sarah lineage, which is Isaac, what became the Jewish tribes, then that's a way to bring peace between the green boxes, the Muslims, who are descendants of Ishmael and Hagar, Egyptians, and the descendants of Sarah and Isaac and Jacob, who become the Jews or the Israelis. It's a family quarrel.
Well, and also I think that goddess initiation sounds like a good idea, because then when you get these downloads we talked about, then you get the humility to realize I do see truth, but maybe my truth is not the absolute and complete truth, but different truths can work together.
Thank you. So you can say, look, I'm a Muslim Sunni, or I'm a Muslim Shia, or I'm a Jewish Kabbalist, or I'm a Jewish Samaritan, or a Jewish Reformed, or whatever.
Yeah.
That's the box I'm an Anglican Christian,
Right.
That's my box.
I'm saying this is my truth.
But that's only just the window that I'm looking at the absolute onto.
Yeah.
Think of these as stained glass. It'd be lovely to make put this into 3D as an architectural form, and you have each one as a window.
Yeah.
Looking onto a central meditation space. So you could design meditation.
Yeah, and the sun
space.
Going through that would be lovely.
Yeah, and then have the sun coming through. And so that's just the window where my bit of the light is coming through. But if I move here, I can see it from your eyes.
Right.
And then we could all learn humility. And you see, what I want for this planet is collective enlightenment. When I was very young, like in my teens, I took Buddhist initiation, which is the red one.
Yeah.
I discovered Tibetan Tantra, and I fell in love with the Diamond Path, Vajrayana. Why can't we all get enlightened now?
Right.
That's what I want. It seems to me all the suffering in the world's coming because people aren't enlightened enough.
Yeah.
They're greedy, selfish, egotistical, violent. All that goes when you reach enlightenment.
Right. Well, since we're on the subject,
Yeah.
I've heard you talk about, and I think you've written a book about it, Sophiaphobia.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
why would people be afraid of knowledge and wisdom and enlightenment? Why?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I've struggled with that a long time because I've been trying to get everybody enlightened, and of course people seem to be stuck in their ignorance and wanting to be. I had discussions with this about this with my dear friend Dr Zaki Badawi, who ran the Muslim college where I taught. He was a Muslim scholar, trained in Al-Azhar University in Cairo, very learned Muslim, and he said the trouble with you lot, Thomas, in the West, all you Christian types, is you're afraid of knowledge because you believe in the Garden of Eden stuff, and the snake brought bad news, and the apple, and so too much knowledge is dangerous for you. So whereas in Islam, although we come from the same Judeo-Christian sort of Islamic fundamental baseline story, we don't think of it like that. We think that knowledge is sacred and learning is very sacred. So the scholar is the most important Muslim. And the slogan, the ink of the scholar is worth more than the blood of the martyr. Zaki Badawi taught me this. That's why I set up some of my work in the Middle East and things.
Right.
And I think Sophiaphobia is... Wisdom brings responsibility. When you know something, then you have to act on it. It's not just a passive thing. So, for instance, because I've studied, I also have to give out. That's why I teach. That's why I set up projects like my Truth and Reconciliation Commissions and so on.
So it's more work.
Have to be active. It means more work. I'd have a much easier life if I was just like a normal academic, just studying one little field of knowledge and just churning out papers and publishing them. That's what most academics do.
Yeah.
They're afraid of the bigger picture. They don't want to know the big scope of knowledge.
Then they have to do stuff.
Then they'd have to get off their backsides and actually do something and
Right.
campaign for peace and oppose ignorance
Right.
actively. Poor old Nietzsche had trouble also in the 19th century. He was trying to wake up academics from their little bourgeois slumbers, where they're all comfortable with what they know and they parade it, even though they know only a tiny thing, like specialists. And he wrote lambasts against this parochialism of scholars. You know, he said, "When will we awaken?"
Yeah.
You know, so I was inspired by Nietzsche when I was young to like become a real philosopher.
Yeah.
And a true philosopher is someone who loves wisdom, isn't afraid of it. I'll walk to the ends of the earth with my love of wisdom.
Yeah.
And that's why I like Jesus, in spite of his not coming back for his final initiation. He had courage. I admire that. That's why I'm also happy to stand in the ranks of his supporters as a Christian, because I admire that courage. And Buddha and all the truly great, even, you know, and Muhammad and Ali, all the truly great saints of the planet, have that love of wisdom to death.
Yeah.
You know.
I think also a sense of curiosity is important. And it's fun. I mean, I remember when I first started in Wicca, I was a bit warned. They were saying that you do get changed on a very deep level when you go through these trainings, when you learn things, that you will change and probably your life will change as well.
Right.
So I think that also could be a part of it, because, you know, change is also scary, I think.
Thank you. Yes, that the other reason, more metaphysically, why people are afraid of wisdom is that it does require transformation,
Right.
and ego has to go. You know, when we die, the ego, like you and me, we're just in this incarnation now, and we have the personality that we are. All that goes in front of the fire of the absolute. We become the naked soul again.
Right.
And that's difficult because we get attached to aspects of our identity. And so, and this relates to things like nationalism and racism, you know, people in incarnation as a whatever, white, black, red, whatever type body they're in, they think, well, I'm the best, you know, I'm X, we're the best, so we're going to kill all the others. All that goes when you enter the fire of universal wisdom. All that ego, nationalist nonsense just evaporates, and you have to stand naked before the absolute spirit, which to me was the point of the Moses revelation. When Moses was on Sinai, that's what he saw. He wasn't sent, like, I tell you what, go down and create a little tribe that can then go and conquer and destroy all the other tribes in my name. He wasn't given a tribal god, he was given the absolute, like, Lord of universal wisdom of all the tribes. Because he'd learned in Egypt, Moses, kind of from the same schools I was from. And then he'd learned from the Semitic desert, the poor people, the downtrodden, the refugees, these wandering Habiru. And he realised that they're all one. Because the Egyptians on a bad day were a bit arrogant, like we are the only. I don't think I was, but I think some Egyptians were, like they were the only civilized people, and those desert tribes were nothing, you know. So I think Moses got the download of the absolute, and you know, that's what we need. And you're right. Whereas, you know, to see the living Lord on Mount Sinai, your ego has to go.
Yeah.
And it's scary for people.
It's very scary.
It's scary.
So that's why I think it's good to have a real sense of curiosity about it.
Thank you. And the sense of humour as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
You take yourself too seriously.
High five, Thomas.
You're done. Yeah, okay. Bless you. Okay, look, shall we stop there? Because we've got...
Yes,
you know,
and my computer died.
have you finished?
So,
okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you so much for interviewing me and discussing. And
Thank you, Thomas.
you know,
It was lovely.
we'll continue the conversation. And thank you for coming all the way from Sweden. I know you have to go back tomorrow, but you know,
Yes,
give
but
my love to the land of the runes.
I will.
And I just want to say one thing about, I mean, I love the Norse traditions. They're also in the pagan thing. And I love Odin because I admire his courage. He also had to hang upside down to get his runes and the sacrifice he took. So he's another wisdom initiate, if you want. And Thomas Carlyle talks about Odin. Now, whether there was a figure like a priest on whom the legends lay, or whether it's a deity, you know, I suspend judgment. It seems to me there's a lineage of Odins
Yeah.
the great priests of that culture.
People willing to do the work for wisdom.
Correct.
So-
That's what we're doing, and the opposite to Sophiaphobia.
Yeah.
So they're proper lovers of wisdom, and so long may it flourish, and
Oh, yeah.
keep it up. Thank you.
Thank you.